about Brazil, I will ask Boris Falso to be the keynote speaker, because he's an historian. The other one have been participants. So, not now. In a few minutes, you can think about what can be said decently about Brazil.
Okay, before we turn to Brazil, I think we should start a Q&A conversation here section. So, is there anybody? So, go first, then Sergio Amaral second. Boris, if the president allows you to. Okay, so go ahead. Go.
You know, there's an obvious question about soft power. There's an obvious question about soft power. I mean, what does the United States do with Karzai, Netanyahu, or even Brazilian foreign policy now that it's not working?
If they're comparable.
I should say again about a Brazilian foreign policy in which it, let's say, loses no opportunity to enter into, not into violent confrontation, but into an insulting confrontation with the United States. And more countries are doing this. And especially in the cases of Israel and Karzai and Afghanistan, these are client states. What do you do about that?
Well, first thing important to remember is that soft power doesn't solve all problems. What soft power does is it can help to create an enabling or disabling environment. So if you lose your attractiveness, you may have a disabling environment, such as Bush confronted after he lost his soft power. So even his friend Vicente Fox, who wanted to help him out for a second resolution in the UN, couldn't do it because being pro-Bush was the kiss of death in Mexican politics. So a disabling environment is pretty clear to see. Whether you can create an enabling environment is more difficult. If you look at the Israeli situation, Obama actually right now doesn't have much soft power in Israel. He's probably, ironically, Obama's standing is lowest in probably Israel and the Palestinian territories for different reasons. But so Israel actually has a fair amount of soft power over the U.S. Obama doesn't have much soft power over Israel. Israel has soft power in the U.S. not just because of Jewish population, but many Christians are very pro-Israel. Some for religious reasons, but some because they see this as a small, beleaguered democracy that should be protected and so forth. So the concept of soft power doesn't necessarily always work for us. It can work for others. And in this case, soft power helps Israel more than it helps Obama or the United States. On Karzai, that's a very interesting puzzle, because what you've seen in the American military is a change in doctrine to incorporate soft power. So if you read the new counterinsurgency doctrines developed by General Petraeus, they say what you have to do is focus on winning the minds of civilians. So it's not how many of the enemy you kill, it's how many of the civilians can you protect and win. So the theory of counterinsurgency is what they call clear, hold, and build. You use your hard power to clear away the enemy. You then try to train enough of the local government people to hold the situation, and then you fill in and build clinics, roads, bridges, schools, things that can win the support of the population. So you start with hard power, you fill behind it with soft power. That's the theory of counterinsurgency. The trouble is, if you have a lousy government in Kabul, who holds? The Marines clear in Marja, and USAID can help pay for building the schools and clinics. But if you have a corrupt local police and a corrupt government and a bad ally in Karzai, an ineffective, then you're stuck. your theory of counterinsurgency, which is a smart power theory in the sense it combines hard and soft power at the tactical level, but it may not work because a key piece of the puzzle is missing. And I think I think Obama's wrestling with this right now. I mean, if you read the papers in the last week or so, the question is, should we disinvite Karzai to Washington? He was supposed to come. Should we, Obama goes over and takes a surprise trip and meets with Karzai. They've tried all sorts of ways to try to press Karzai, but Karzai is a weak reed to build a policy on.
The same thing happened in Vietnam 40 years ago.
That's right. And what?
Yeah, I mean, it was, Diem was overthrown and killed.
Yeah, I think. My reaction to this is that the moral of the story should be a smart strategy for the United States is don't get involved in land wars in Asia. Period. I mean, so now the question is, if that's a good strategy for the long run, how do you get from here to there? And I think what Obama is trying to do is build up to bargain and then build down. But can you do it? And the theory is fine, but Karzai is the missing piece of the puzzle. So I don't know whether it's going to work or not. I'd say it's 50-50.
You started with an amazing remark, which puts at stake our capacity as experts in international relations to assess what's going on. In the 90s, the prevailing idea was that of the decline of the United States. 10 years later, unipolar war, not only in the United States. Our friend Vedrin talked about the hyperpuissance.
Yeah.
Then, 10 years later, again decline. Now, if we try not to stick at some moments, but to put this in relative terms and in perspective, in relative terms and in trends and in perspective, the picture may be different. Let's take the economy. The United States represented more than 50% of the world GDP after the Second World War. Now it represents 24%. In the military area, there is no decline. There is at least the permanence of a status quo which is of superiority. But if you take it politically, in relative terms, perhaps there is a relative decline. The United States cannot afford to take decisions alone and has to negotiate with its partners on a multilateral basis. So instead of this idea of trying to measure either decline or restoration of power, isn't that true that after the world crisis, the recent world crisis, we had a reinforcement of some trends, and this is a rebalancing of the world economy, a larger place for the emergent economies, namely China. We have a rebalancing of the political position of countries, and perhaps the only area in which you don't have any kind of rebalancing, at least for the time being, would be in the military dimension.
Well, I think that's right, but let me make some qualifications, Sergio, in the following sense. The Americans were half of world product after World War II because World War II strengthened the Americans and that weakened all the others. So it was artificial. And so America went from half to a quarter of world product, but all that was finished by 70. When Nixon closed the gold window was the symbol of that decline from 45 to, let's say, early 70s. Since then, the American share of world product has been about the same. And it also, ironically, is about the same share as the American part of world product in 1918. So in some ways, World War II was an anomaly. Now, I think American share of world product in the future will probably go down somewhat. I mean, I don't think it's going to stay at 20% forever. And it'll go down because of the rise of the economies you mentioned, Brazil, China, and others. But I think it's a mistake to think that that this is new. In other words, some of this is since '70, it's been more or less constant. The other thing that's worth remembering on this question of the need to work with others, we sometimes forget that even when the Americans were allegedly a hegemon, in 1945 to 50, we were the only country with nuclear weapons, complete dominance of the new technology. We had, as you said, half of world product. It looked like we were, a colossus, but we were not able to prevent, in quotes, the loss of China to communism. We were not able to prevent the Soviets from developing a nuclear weapon. We were not able, even though the Republicans campaigned on it in 1952, to roll back communism in Eastern Europe. So the idea that you have a lot of power resources doesn't mean you can always get the power outcomes you want. And that's been true for a long time. I think what is new, though, of what you mentioned is what Fareed Zakaria calls the rise of the rest. I mean, the fact that India is now vibrant economically, the fact that China is growing at the rates it's growing, the fact that Brazil has taken off since a certain man became president. I mean, these are things that are new and important in the world, and I think we see those in things like the replacement of the G8 with the G20, which I think is healthy. I think the thing that's going to be difficult is how do you coordinate action as you get more players involved? Because the more players you have involved, the more difficult it is to get coordination and action. And that also gives temptations for a lot of free riding. I mean, I think Norm Gall mentioned earlier some of these statements in foreign policy. I mean, when you go to the UN conference on climate in Copenhagen, 182 countries there or something, or 192, and you find that you try to negotiate, and you have a G77, whatever that means, led by a Sudanese named Lumumba, who accuses the Western position on climate change of being genocide. That's the theater of the absurd. That's what's called free riding, when you have large numbers and need coordination. What's in it for Sudan? Free riding. And some of the kinds of statements about foreign policy, like Chavez or so forth, this is free riding. I mean, why not kick the Americans because it's free? And it gets you, what it does is it gets you some support in domestic politics. But it doesn't solve any of the world's real problems. And I think the question that we're going to have to figure out is how do you get that coordination to deal with real problems? And that's going to require not replacing the UN, because the UN is important, but it's going to remain supplementing the UN, figuring out how to meet in smaller groups to negotiate real things and then take them back to the UN. So if you look at climate, Todd Stern, who's the State Department's negotiator on climate, points out that with 8 political entities, now I treat Europe as one, but 8, you have 80% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So rather than go to a meeting with 192 where somebody named Lumumba plays G77 politics, not because it's going to help the climate, but because it's going to help him for, free riding on a variety of other things, deal with 8 entities and see if you can't hammer out some reasonable propositions about how we deal with a serious problem. I think that's going to be, so as I see the problem of power, it's going to be, it's not going to be that we lack the power we had in 1945. In some ways, America is not as strong as it was, but it never was. The problem is, how are we going to be able to coordinate action when there's so many more people in the game. It's Harlan Cleveland, who used to be an ambassador to the UN at one point, said, the key problem we're going to face is how do you get everybody in on the act and still get action? That, to me, is going to be the big problem for American, not just American power, for any power. Not easy.
I think that your concept of power is, I think, is very interesting and very fruitful. On the other hand, I always, many years ago, I was teaching business administration. I used to say that power meant not to control people, but to get results with people.
Mm-hmm.
What's basically the same thing that you are saying. This is one thing. The other thing is that power, and your book is quite clear about that, it's changing. The idea of power is changing. This concept of power is a change. Then what, in the past, power of countries was essentially power for security, for peace.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that this is not anymore. I believe that the probability of wars among major countries today is very, very, very small. You can always think, but it's very, very small for many reasons. On the other hand, you have other, but then what objective do you have? My impression is that the objectives that we have are objectives are objectives in relation to climate change, in relation to drugs, in relation to diseases, things like that. So, but I don't think that countries, I don't think that either the United States or China, and maybe Brazil, are not understanding this yet. That the nature of power, what's important to have power, is not anymore for security, is for peace. This is always important, but decreased enormously its importance. Our comments.
Well, I largely agree with you, but I think we have to realize that while the positive sum aspects of power are going to become more important, we still can't get away from the zero-sum aspects. If you're located in Europe, you don't have to worry about power for security. Or if you're looking at the U.S. and Canada, the idea of war is unthinkable. So in some ways, if you think about the way the world is now, the British ambassador or diplomat, Robert Cooper, said the world is divided into three parts. He said for the post-modern world or the post-industrial world, what you just said is absolutely true. You know, New Zealand and Australia aren't going to go to war with each other. Japan, U.S. aren't going to war. War is finished for this. But if you look at the second part of the world, what he calls the industrializing world, the countries that are rising, China, India, and so forth, then there's still the prospect of war. After all, among the BRIC states, Russia went to war against Georgia within the last 2 years. India and China have had a face-off. I was in New Delhi in January. Let me tell you, the Indians are worried stiff about Chinese claims on this border state. And they have had a war in the past. So, you know, among the rising industrial states, it's not so clear. Brazil is fortunate because Brazil is naturally dominant. It doesn't have a major security problem. It's so big that we were joking earlier, I don't think Paraguay is going to try to get back the territory it lost. So I mean, Brazil is essentially doesn't have a security problem just because it's the dominant country by natural forces. But the third area that Cooper makes in terms of dividing the world into three types of states are the pre-industrial. And there, wars are rampant. I mean, if you look at Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, and so forth, then security still does matter. So we're in a world in which we have to keep two concepts in our mind at the same time and not let one overwhelm the other. We're going to have power for security in some circumstances, but power with others on these transnational issues, and trying to keep those two things present in the mind at the same time, or present in policy, is going to be very important. But largely, I agree with you.
Professor Knight, my question is, this power with other nations, as you said, to enhance coordination policy, we need to build more trust, we need to build more understanding, we need to build a sense of continuity, so those things prevail over time. But if we're talking about power over others, we have national politics more and more being played on our tribal minds, on our prejudices. Mm-hmm. So how can we conciliate in international affairs seeking more trust, continuity? On the other hand, you're running for domestic elections where you have to play against prejudice. You have to say, you have to find your scapegoats to criticize. You have to criticize religion. You have to criticize things domestically to get votes. And I think the international question that most illustrate that is the Non-Proliferation Treaty now. So you have Iran and North Korea playing for its national audience with a very serious international question. So how soft power will help us to create this more sense of trust when the national politics is trying to be played against trust, against dissent?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's certainly one very relevant to your concerns of teaching leadership. Leaders can get support by the opposition of one group against another, or they can get support by trying to pull groups together. And it's often so easy to do the first and so hard to do the second. But extraordinary leaders are able to do the second. And I mean, probably the most dramatic case of this, of course, is Nelson Mandela. Here's a man who's been deprived of a good chunk of his life, locked away for no good reason at all. And, I mean, racism is no good reason to lock somebody away. And he comes out, and you could say, I might have succumbed to this. I'm going to have revenge. Instead of that, he says, only if I want South Africa to succeed, I have to pull these people together, not get my support by providing them. And so he picks up all sorts of symbols that essentially overcome this gap. I mean, he goes to a rugby game, and which is a team that's almost all white South Africans, and he puts on the game shirt of the Springboks, which is in the past been a white team and a white symbol. Now that's leadership of intergroup leadership rather than dividing groups. And the trouble is it's so easy to do the opposite. It's so much easier to do the opposite. And so if you look at China today, to go back to the Chinese situation, nationalism is very strong in China. And the Chinese government fears that without nationalism, it won't have the glue that holds the place together. Communism is no longer a unifying ideology, so they have turned to ethnic Han nationalism. But that's a very dangerous instrument to play with. And I think I think you've identified a very crucial question, which is how do we create incentives for leaders to use intergroup leadership rather than dividing groups? and it's not easy. One thing, though, if you take it to the international phase, is that institutions matter. And if you can get institutions which can reassure, that can help create trust. I mentioned this morning when I was talking to the students at FAPI that if you look at Germany and France, which fought 3 wars in, 70 years, and yet today we say absolutely unthinkable, the 3 big things that changed is they both became democratic, they developed a rich web of interdependence, and they put it within a framework of institutions in the European community, the European Union, which meant that you could afford trust. And internationally, if you take your non-proliferation example, the International Atomic Energy Agency is a way for states which say, all right, I will not develop nuclear weapons because I know that it would not be a good thing if I develop nuclear weapons, but how can I trust that you won't do the same? You say one thing and not do another. If you have the IAEA, it's a way to say, I can trust, because there are going to be inspectors who are going to trust. And that's why the additional protocol, for example, is important, so that the inspectors aren't blinded. The IAEA and the additional protocol are extremely important for developing institutionally this kind of trust at the international level. So there are devices we can use. It's not easy. I mean, I grant that. But institutions can provide frameworks which allow trust to develop. And when we find some that work, we should cherish them. And I think the IAEA is one of those.
Mr. Nye, I agree there is a lot of free riding around. But I think supporting Iran is not free riding. Opposing sanctions in this hour is not free riding. I think in that case, particular case, Brazilian diplomacy is crossing a frontier. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I think the Iran case is very difficult because we know pretty well that Iran wants nuclear weapons. It wants nuclear energy, but it also wants nuclear weapons. And if you look at the material that has been provided to the IAEA and the judgment made by the IAEA when it looked at this, it's pretty clear that the North Koreans provided to the Iranians things which have nothing to do with civilian nuclear energy, that have everything to do with making a bomb. Then you say, well, what would be the effect of having a bomb in that area? Well, the danger is that it's going to be a chain reaction. Then you have a Saudi bomb, a Turkish bomb, a Syrian bomb, and so forth. Then you say, what are the chances that nuclear weapons will be used someday if that many countries have bombs, some of them not being terribly stable countries? The answer is it goes up. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing. So when Ahmadinejad and Khamenei say, this is only for peaceful purposes, and we'll, just trust us, just negotiate with us. Well, the Europeans started negotiating with them in 2005. And Bush finally, after all his mistakes, did support that. The Iranians never negotiated seriously. In September of last year, when the Iranians were discovered building a enrichment facility underground in Qum, in addition to their other facilities, they were embarrassed. They first put a proposal on the table to negotiate. They withdrew it within a week. That doesn't strike me as behavior which is consistent with peaceful nuclear energy, but is consistent with the alternative hypothesis of building a bomb. So along comes Brazilian diplomacy. And Brazilian diplomacy says, we'll support Ahmadinejad. Is that a help or a hindrance. Now, if you said, well, we're going to get them to negotiate, then it's a help. If, on the other hand, Ahmadinejad is trying to say, can I get the Brazilians, the Chinese, and others to make sure that I don't suffer any sanctions so I can continue down this path, then it's a hurt, not a help. I don't see much evidence yet from Iranian behavior that Brazilian diplomacy has helped as opposed to hurt. But I'd be happy to be wrong. Yeah.
A very brief comment on the. It's okay? No. It's all right now? It's all right. Okay. Well, a very brief comment on the Iran and Brazil and the atomic issue. Behind the Brazilian diplomacy, there are some ideas about the possibility for Brazil to have more competence in producing weapons. This is not the argument used. I think in practice what is behind is the sense that you have to have the independence to take our own decisions in that matter. I think it's a risky position. I remember when we have, after the military in power, we start to reconcile with Argentina. And one of the main issues was exactly the military issue. Because of missiles, they had the Condor program. We have also a military program. And also some attempts to build a very niche attempts to build a bomb in Brazil. And the decision was exactly what you said. Let's try to see if it will be possible to build together with the Argentinians a framework, an institution to take care of the issue. And we did. We did. I remember once I went to Rio to sign up. I was at the time foreign minister, to sign a protocol with the Argentinian foreign minister. And from that time on, Brazilians and Argentina have the right to monitorize each other program. Mm-hmm. Then the IAEA asked for still more, and we agreed with an additional, control. So now with the enrichment of uranium, which is being processed in Brazil, it will be each checked at the beginning and at the end to see if we are not enriching more than a level 5%. Probably we have capacity to do more. This is not difficult from the technological viewpoint. It depends on a political decision and resources to do. But anyhow, the decision never been taken to go far from that point. Now, the Brazilian diplomacy is opposing to sign the additional protocol to the first one, the IAEA. So, and why? Is that because of the same? Because they are also interested in continuing to have the possibility to go further in this kind of dual technology. It's also clear that following the constitution in Brazil, it's impossible to go toward a bomb. This is clear, and I don't believe that in Brazil the argument in favor of armament race would be sustainable. But politically, yes, it's a little bit dangerous because some people start by saying, "Well, why not? Why not?" And the deal, not the deal, but the fact that Brazil is playing an obscure role in the case of Iran is tied to that idea. Some people in Brazil would prefer to have more possibility to go further. And I think this is a risky situation because we don't have enemies. So it seems to be senseless to be ready to counterattack, because that's the ideology in Brazil, not to attack, but to counterattack. Who? The Argentina, they don't have. Maybe the Americans. Well, in that case, it's better to go to guerrilla. So I agree with your.
Well, your example of the Brazil-Argentina rapprochement in the 1980s is one of the great success stories of diplomacy. I mean, I remember in the 1970s when the two countries each had a military government and each country was thinking about nuclear weapons. And if that had continued, you'd be a lot worse off today than you are. So I think that diplomacy of the 1980s was really very, very important.
Can I make a question to President Cardoso that I think it might be interesting for this conversation, which is it is written in the Constitution that we are Brazil is sort of forbidden to make an atomic bomb. But there have been people in high ranking offices in this government that have been very outspoken against the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and saying that maybe we should consider the possibility of withdrawing from the treaty. What do you make out of it? Do you think it's a real possibility? In other words, how deep-seated is the conviction within the military and the political elite that it's not worthwhile withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
I don't believe this is an idea supported by the military. This idea came from the intellectuals. Yes, not the military. This is a kind of dream by some intellectuals, including, I don't know to what extent Mangabeira Unger would support that idea, but maybe some. And now the man who has been the number 2 at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Pinheiro Guimarães, Samuel Pinheiro Guimarães, and he was appointed by President Lula as Minister for Strategic Issues, which is an important position, and he published a book sustaining that view. So this is, and now this is a kind of idea of grandeur, something like the greatness of Brazil. Up to now, it's just ideology. It's just, dream of intellectuals. But I think it's necessary to say very clear, this is not a dream, this is a nightmare. It could produce very bad results for the development of Brazil, not just in terms of our peaceful development, but in development in general. Because we are free to have technological advancements because everyone trusts on Brazil. As far as we start to provoke some doubts about our trustfulness, well, this will provoke also some negative reactions to Brazil. So I think this is an important point to be raised, not to leave, as if it was not important. It is important. Intellectuals have some importance because they have ideas, and ideas are very dangerous.
Yeah, they can cause a lot of damage. Guillaume.
You said that Brazil is lucky because it has no security problems, and actually it doesn't have security problems. But I think that if you don't have security problems, you can imagine that you have no threats, and if you have no threats, you are not challenged to produce a sort of long-term strategic thought, and you think that anything is possible. At this time, I think there is a link between this obsession about the bomb and the Brazilian obsession with leadership. This wishing to mix into Middle East politics and things like that. So I don't think that it's necessary, lucky, to have no security problems.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. On the other hand, you all know better than I, and I'm just a visitor, but if I were to say what's the best strategy for Brazil to increase its place and role in the world, I would ask, what is it that's happened over the last 20 years? If you think, Brazil has always been a huge country with enormous resources, but it's not lived up to its potential. In the last 20 years, people are suddenly taking Brazil more seriously. Why? Not because Brazil got a bomb, not because Brazil has a Middle East diplomatic position. It's because Brazil got its own internal house in order and developed a strategy for curbing inflation, for having a sound currency, for supporting entrepreneurship, and for developing a rapid rate of economic growth. And followed that with beginning to address some of the social and economic problems that Brazil faces. that has had a huge impact on how people regard Brazil. And so if I were thinking what should be my strategy as Brazilian, I'd say do more of that. So if you say what's going to continue Brazil on this path upward, it's going to be things like how can I improve education? How can I improve the inequality problem? How can I create a climate for entrepreneurship? How can I invest more in science and technology in my universities? These are the things that are going to make Brazil important, not what it says on the Middle East peace process. I'm not objecting to Brazil taking a position on issues like the Middle East peace process, but I'm saying that that's not what's going to, I mean, if you say 10 years from now, how will people say Brazil is? Is it more important than it is today or less important than it is today? Well, I think the answer to that is look back 10 years. Look back to what's happened in the past, and you'll see what has brought Brazil to where it is now, and do more of the same. It would be my, I mean, I'm just a, one of these dangerous intellectuals. But that would be my recommendation.
Well, since Professor Nye wants to have a flavor of Brazilian politics and the relationship between domestic politics and Brazilian foreign policy, I will resort to Ambassador Barbosa and ask him to talk a little bit about Brazilian foreign policy and in this administration and the platform of the Workers' Party. I think you feel very strong about it. I think you are the one to talk about it now. Let's say just a few minutes.
Well, I think that in the last 8 years, the Brazilian foreign policy was increasingly influenced by the Workers' Party ideology. And this, I think, was a trade-off with the acceptance of what was called the neoliberal economic policy that was started in the previous government. And Lula embraced everything, continued the economic policy, and something had to be given to the Workers' Party. And right from the beginning, President Lula appointed the former international secretary for the Workers' Party to be his main diplomatic advisor in the office of the president. And he stated publicly that his foreign policy, Lula's foreign policy, was different from all other foreign policies of previous governments because he had a dual track to deal with foreign countries. He had the official foreign ministry approach with contact with the government, with the governments of the neighboring countries especially, and he had an informal channel to be connected with the socialists, leftist parties that, as you know, took gradually office in many South American countries. So sometimes there was even a lack of coordination between the two hands in foreign policy. And this influence has grown along these 8 years. And recently, one very, in my view, very emblematic thing was the affiliation of the foreign minister, a career diplomat, to the Workers' Party. This was the first time ever a diplomat being minister, foreign minister, became affiliated to a political party. And I think that the main influence of the Workers' Party was in South America, the policy that was followed here with ideological affinities with many of the new heads of states. And a change in the main thrust of foreign policy for a long time because of the vision of the world. The vision of the world that the Workers' Party brought to foreign policy was completely different from the past. They have, in my view, Lula brought to the government the idea of a unionist, you know, the negotiation between the employee and the employer. He brought this to the foreign policy, and the division between North and South, the developed and the developed world, and one of the main lines of foreign policy is the South-South cooperation at the expenses of the relationship with the developed world. That's why today you have 36 new embassies, many in Africa, in small countries in the Caribbean, just to show the flag and to hoping to get support in an eventual dispute for the Security Council permanent membership. So I think that the examples were given here, including, in my view, the position in relation to Iran has to do with this, and the idea that Brazil should have a more visible, more forceful position in the Middle East, in Africa, in the nuclear discussion, and in other issues, comes from this view that this perception that Brazil belongs to the underdeveloped world, and we have to have our own space. You know that new institutions have been formed here in the region with the support of Brazil, with the idea that we need to have our own institutions without the presence of the United States. And just to finalize, I examined in detail a document that was produced by the Workers' Party in a Congress they had recently. And there were several passages in this paragraphs in this document that support what I'm saying. And I just quote one. There is one paragraph that literally says that the Brazilian foreign policy is geared to confront the United States. It's written there. So you may explain many of the actions that Brazil is taking if you have this broader view that the Workers' Party introduced in foreign policy.
I would like to add, not to confront with you, something. I heard Ambassador Rubens Recupero, your colleague, saying something very interesting during a reunion, a meeting we had. And I agree with him that probably we have a change of, how do you say that in English? Paradigm. We have a change of paradigm in Lula's government in the last 2 years, for the reasons that Rubens indicated, and maybe because of some ideological reasons that Lula and his group sustain, and also a sort of megalomania that that these people assume. What is this change of paradigm? Not to talk too much. I think there are two things. One is a change on economic politics, yes. The policy, which is not the same as it was during all those years. I'm not elaborating on that, but anyway. The other thing is an emphasis of a change regarding the foreign policy. One example was not mentioned here. It's the example of Cuba, which is a scandal. I support the idea that Lula's position was very effective. It was very effective in showing to the world the contradictions and the problems of this government. Because I always had, not me, but many people had the impression that for good reasons, for obvious reasons, but in general, the image of the president and his government in foreign countries was hiding negative aspects of the government. Of course, what is going to happen in the future with the new election and so we don't know. Maybe we know a bit more than what's going to happen in China, for instance. But anyway.
Just to complement, one thing that is very striking when you analyze foreign policy is that foreign policy became an issue. It was not an issue in Brazil. It's an issue in the United States, in other countries, but not here. And I think that the reason for this is that for the first time, the Workers' Party broke the consensus. Foreign policy in Brazil largely, to a large extent, was consensual. It was bipartisan, as you say in the United States. Recently, there was a division because those who are against the Workers' Party or the philosophy of the Workers' Party realize that the influence of the party make foreign policy ideologized, politicized. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why there is a wide discussion today here in Brazil, in the media, television, academic discussions, in the Congress, because there is the consensus was broken.
But do you believe, asking you, there will be this issue will appear in the campaign or the presidency?
No, I don't think it will, because as I said, it's new, the fact that foreign policy became an issue. Foreign policy doesn't provide votes. No? And perhaps it would be mentioned one or 2 points related to the human rights, with specific concrete questions that have to do with a more ample constituency.
President Cardoso has just asked to speak because he wants to defend President Lula. Yeah. And to rebut all this senseless criticism.
Give the floor first to Sergio, because I will defend. I will be in favor of Lula, thinking about everyone.
Yeah, I think that the foreign policy for the first time may become an issue at the elections. Not a central issue, but an issue, for 2 reasons. First, Rubens pointed out, it has become controversial. And the second, and most important, is that the non-well-informed, if I may say so, public opinion, the middle classes, the lower income groups, are proud of Lula's foreign policy. What do they say? Is that, see, this guy, he's like us. He hasn't studied. He didn't go to the university, but he goes abroad, and he is respected. He confronts the U.S. He's not afraid. And this kind of approach... and I think this may be a subject for the elections for that reason. And second is the nationalistic approach, which always has some appeal.
One more small point. Very quick. Lula got along very well with George Bush. Very well.
But Lula doesn't go along very well with Obama. This is interesting.
All your ex-ministers are trying to prevent you.
No, it's just a comment. If Lula's TV program recently, one week ago, started with proclaiming his results in terms of foreign policy. So he himself has, in this sort of balance of his achievements, made the issue that foreign policy, as he conducted, was a very relevant and new thing. So I think he wants to put this on the record.
Okay, let me try to defend President Lula's foreign policy and other positions in Brazil. It's true there are some elements in Lula's government that are intending to break the paradigm, the former paradigm. We have to take into account, first of all, that Brazil is now much more important in the world than has been ever. The political weight of Brazil has no comparison. Really, because of the reason Professor Nye said, because we become much more serious people, much more capable to have good economic outputs, also because we have been able to consolidate the institutions, so on and so forth. Altogether, this allows Brazil to have a stronger voice at international affairs. Well, so it is normal that President Lula will use these tools to take the benefit of the situation, etc. They have to emphasize ruptures. This is necessary because of the domestic set of policies. To what extent the ruptures really occurred? In some cases, yes. In some cases, yes, but not much more in terms of rhetoric than in practical terms. Look, Cuba. What Lula did in Cuba is inexcusable because it has not to do with the relationship between Brazil and Cuba. It has to do with human rights, which is much more serious. And if you look at the list of votes by Brazilian delegation in several situations of human rights, it's scandalous, because this never have been raised to the Brazilian population. Never. This has been is a decision interna corporis, taken by the bureaucracy of foreign affairs. You see, so this never was politicized here, because this will have some cost to Lula. And in Cuba, the point was not the relationship between Cuba and Brazil. We had always, since President Sarney, good relations with Cuba. We have been always against the embargo in Cuba. I did pay a state visit to Fidel. Fidel came several times to Brazil under my government without any problem. Wow. I have also with Christ. But anyhow, the point is that the relations between Brazil and Cuba have not changed. There maybe now have more possibilities to be active because we have more resources. Well, I remember when long time ago, the decision was to allow Petrobras, the oil company, to invest in Cuba. And they did. I was there to see the exploitation, so on and so forth. So the relations have not changed. It's much more a kind of label, more rhetoric in the case of Cuba. In the case of Iran, it's different. In the case of Iran, really, we are crossing the threshold. But anyhow, in other cases, is less clear. All the disputes with the United States, I mean, economic trade disputes, start during my government. So we approve. Oh yes, no doubts about it. See? So instead, the government, inside Lula's government, there are several sectors. In average, political people just don't pay attention to foreign policy up to now. Maybe we will be in the future different because of our because our weight in political affairs. But it's true that they don't pay any attention to that. There are lots of concrete cases to show that what has been said. Foreign policy is voteless. You see, when I was appointed as foreign minister, the head of my party, Ulisses Guimarães, said, "Are you crazy? Are you getting votes from Angola?" This was the approach, you see. So now it's beginning to change. Maybe in the electoral campaign, but I doubt. I doubt because it's not easy for people to understand the subtleties of foreign policy. What will be maybe stressed now is some nationalistic approach. And by nationalism in Brazil, what's really behind is the state control over everything. This is an old tradition coming from Spain, Portugal, and ourselves. The role of the state has been always not just effective, but also welcome by people in general. And behind, that's another difference now, political difference. Behind the idea now is not just the government, not the state, but the state controlled by one party, and this party connected to unions, and the unions having enormous amount of resources because of pension funds. So this thing is a block of power. And if there is nuance, in terms of nuance, because I'm referring more to trends than to concrete separate realities, because if we separate two blocks in Brazil, working class party and PSDB, well, if you go to see what each one think about, the differences are not very profound. Only the consequence of action are much more profound than the sentiment of people. The sentiment, average, is nationalistic, rather bureaucratic, so on and so forth. But anyhow, what is hated in Brazil is not capitalism. There is no socialism at stake at all. It's liberalism. Liberalism is hated. So to be qualified as neoliberal is an insult, not because of the new, because of the liberal. Even without the new, it would be an insult, because liberalism here means laissez-faire. That is to say, the market prevails over the society. So that is of course, ideological. No one supports the idea as such, but the perception is like that. So, and in the case of if now approaching the elections, if Lula's candidate will win the elections, probably this will be still more strong, the sense that the state has to control. Bureaucracy prevails, and behind, party, one party. If the other side will be victorious, probably will be more flexible, more, in that sense, more liberal, more open to others' opinions. This is in terms of trends. And this has something to do also with foreign policy, because it's the same. There is a kind of, let's put, elective preferences. How was the German used to say? Elective affinities. Between those who are in favor of a more strong state interference with the so-called rogue states, the Iran, Venezuela, so on and so forth. Meanwhile, those who are more close or more open society will be in opposition of that. So this is what is going on at the level of foreign policy is much more the reflex of these more hidden, trends which are, really polarizing society. I will finalize by saying this is a pure defense of President Lula. That Lula is floating. Lula is not committed to anything. His characteristic is to be able to fly. He's floating around. So from time to time he is in defense of one position or another one, or the contrary of both. And because of that, in spite of the profoundly divisive style of politics supported by his party, he is much more a unifying man. And I think we have to have all in mind all time this. Because if you believe that confronting Lula is a good position, it's not good for elections. Because Lula unifies. We have to do exactly the same to raise the questions in such a way that the society as a whole perceive that there is a path, a road toward a better life. Yeah? So I stop here. I have to speak tomorrow in an important meeting, and I'm preparing what I will do there. Important. In Portuguese tomorrow. No, I don't know. I will ask people about. My liberalism is very, very ample. I will ask people first. Do you prefer French? Why not?
Guillaume, just maybe I think we're running out of time here, so just a very quick question.
Very short comment on the election side.
You need the microphone, please.
Yeah. A short comment on the election side of this conversation. I think that we don't pay enough attention to the fact that the elections will have international results. In South America, for Venezuela, Chavez would do whatever it takes to support Lula. The same for Ecuador, and the same perhaps for Bolivia. So it will make a very big difference for Iran. So this is a fact that can affect the elections. And if you link together all those positions that the Brazilian foreign policy is taking with different rogue countries, they all have a common anti-American sound. And it can, Lula occasionally could campaign all over the country with this us against them, with a very nationalistic view.
I think maybe we can listen to your concluding remarks, and maybe you could tackle this issue of the anti-American component of, because for us it's crucial whether the Obama administration succeeds or not. So, in your opinion, how firm is the domestic backing to the Obama's foreign policy?
Well, let me comment first on what I've heard, which I found absolutely fascinating, and then address that last question. And this may sound a bit odd. So, but as an ignorant outsider, if the price of continuing the Cardoso policies for 8 more years was to kick the Americans in the shin every once in a while, it might have been worth it. No, I mean, I say that not as an American, but as somebody saying, what's good for Brazil? The fact that you made this big turn in the 90s, and then you had a left-wing party continue it, that has really done enormous good for Brazil. And the fact that you have this spirit of, let's not polarize this, very, very healthy. And if the Americans bear the brunt of this by having to listen to some silly things from time to time, I'd much rather see a strong Brazil which continues your policies and put up with a little nonsense in foreign policy than to have a government which is completely American in its foreign policy but doesn't continue the policies that you had domestically. So I found this discussion I just heard very interesting. With that said, there are points which I think are unfortunate. When Brazil loses the capacity to speak up about human rights, the American embargo on Cuba is silly. It's a dumb policy. That's different from not saying when somebody's locked up for their opinions that it's bad. So I hope Brazil doesn't lose that. In any case, I found this a very interesting exchange, and it gives me more confidence in my view about Brazil. On the question of the American policy, there are two questions. One is American policy toward Brazil and Latin America, and the other is American policy general and support for Obama. I think in general, and this is where I give some credit to Bush, even though I wasn't a Bush supporter, I think the American reaction to Chavez and Morales has been, and Correa, has been, don't get too excited. If you get too excited, you fall into their trap. Yeah. What they need is an imperialist enemy. The more we become the imperialist enemy, the more we help them with their problem, which is to rouse domestic support. So I think the reason that Bush treated Lula well, and that Obama, I'm interested about the point about the personal relations, but the general attitude of the Obama administration is keep your eye on the ball. The future is not going to be Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. The future is going to be Brazil, Chile, Colombia, maybe Peru, and let's hope Argentina, though Argentina is a big question mark.
That's great.
And that means, no, but that means that you don't overreact as we have overreacted to Cuba. And I think the interesting point is that policy has been true of both the Republicans and the Democrats. Though on Cuba you have this absolutely crazy domestic political Cuban exile problem, though that too is changing. The younger generation of Cuban Americans is beginning to see that what we've been doing is counterproductive. I think the larger question is will the polarization in American politics, which led to no Republicans voting on health care, will that carry over into foreign policy? So far, it hasn't happened. I mean, on foreign policy, Obama has basically, his Afghanistan policy is bipartisan. His problem is more troubles from the left of his own party than from the Republicans. And the big test, I think, on this will be the treaty, the START treaty he just signed. He has to get 67 votes in the Senate, and he has 59 from the Democrats. So it means he's got 8 Republicans to win. And there's some Republicans like Richard Lugar, who is the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who I think are sufficiently responsible and thoughtful. I think they probably will vote for it. Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who has been working with John Kerry on trying to get some sort of energy legislation, might vote for it. I can imagine that you will get enough votes for this. But this will be an important test case. If this treaty is voted down on party lines, then I will be quite discouraged. But I don't know how to predict that. I think it will probably pass. But the polarization of politics has been very severe on domestic politics. It hasn't been quite so severe yet on foreign policy, and let's hope it doesn't become, because I think basically, when all is said and done, we have a lot to gain from overcoming some of these extreme partisan differences. I wish we had more American politicians who would take the spirit of your comments about your successor, that we'd see more of that in American politics. We're going through a bad period on that now. It might change a bit better in the future.
Well, very briefly, just to say how helpful we are by having the opportunity to talk to you in such a open, discussion in addressing very, very difficult and sensitive issues in practice. So the only way is to be informal and also to be frank. You have been very frank, exposing your ideas. I'm sure your ideas will help us, and they will take the benefits tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.